Hello everyone, today we talk about the transformation of the Roman Empire during 800 years of its existence, fundamentally between the death of Theodosius in 395 AD and the fall of Constantinople into Crusader hands in 1204. This is not really the first time we make a video on Byzantine history stretching such a long time. Yet I think that such videos can be useful, at least in order to get a bit more acquainted to the concept and transformation of evolution. Can't even say, well, maybe it's not the best term, but that can make you look at such a specific entity, because that's fundamentally what the Roman Empire remains. It remains always the same state, it's the same political entity. We stop to the Fourth Crusade because at that point there is even a kind of a territorial discontinuity. There is the fall of Constantinople as the center of the empire, and of course the Paleology will reacquire it, but a lot has changed at that point. It's always the same polity, you can argue, but still certain basic elements have now been either destroyed or have been irremediably compromised. And what I would like to stress, and I did it also in other videos, is really making you understand the problems we have at defining such changes and transformation in a kind of a deterministic way, right? You know, that thing had to go in that way. I mean, after the Battle of Manzikert, no, that was the beginning of the end. The empire would have not recovered anymore. It says, no. I actually, the more I read, and I studied Byzantine history quite some year ago now at university. Not much in detail, but every time I got the opportunity to make an exam, Byzantine history, I chose that. And I realized the more I went in depth to this topic that, albeit Byzantine history is often dealt with on this kind of long-term interpretation, when you look at the details, you realize that nothing basically had to deterministically finish, right? Starting from those people who consider that, like, the Byzantines as non-Romans, that they say, yeah, you know, from you know, the switch to the east, it was just a matter of time before the empire would end. Well, yeah, like 1 millennium of history, which is pretty bizarre, especially when you realize that such empire actually had enormous strength capabilities. It recovered many times. So these are conceptions that really do not make any sense. Still, they are held by many people. Some of you have even criticized me because I use the term Byzantine, but I think anybody who has studied Byzantine history knows what that means and is capable of accepting it, if anything, because it's not specifically, you know, neither a formal name or whatever. It's Byzantine is the Byzantines were obviously Romans, but Byzantine is broader, it's more cultural, it specifies. There is also an economy of grammar, right? Instead of saying, like, that empire that was kind of more in the east, because many people believe that it was also called the Eastern Roman Empire. Enormous mistake. It was nothing like that. Eastern and Western Roman empires were just administrative repartition as long as they existed. Like, you know, when in fact the Western imperial insignia are taken back to consigned back to Constantinople, there is nothing like an Eastern Roman Empire. That was the Roman Empire. Stop. Right? But calling it Byzantine, it's not really wrong either if you know what you're talking about, and as long as you understand that this has nothing to do with formal name and whatever. And, you know, if you behave like a Nazi about this, you know, just think about how in your language you call certain nationalities today that doesn't correspond to etymologically to the name they call themselves. So you should address all your vocabulary in your language to make it fit to. I mean, it's ridiculous, frankly. And since there is a disciplinary branch in Western, worldwide, that is called Byzantinistics, and major, in fact, history authorities in Byzantinistics are aware of the problem, still call themselves Byzantinists. It's not a big deal. Let's use it. Actually, in my videos, if you notice that and you know it if you're a regular follower, that I switch often, like I use Roman and Byzantine at the same time, right? More Roman if I want to stress more, in fact, the legitimate Romanity of the empire. Byzantine if it's more cultural and also talking about other polities that surrounded it, like to make ourselves clearer and not to, and specifying, yeah, we're talking about the Middle Ages or late Antique, whatever. So it's a convention, and every historian is intelligent, should be intelligent enough, let's say, to understand what conventions are used for it, and I think that this one is acceptable and just not a big deal. I will make a video about that, frankly, because I think it's important. So, talking finally about this history, I thought it to organize it in obviously a very approximate way. Obviously, we won't be looking at every single thing, every single emperor, but trying fundamentally to understand how the structure changed, like how this empire transformed over time. It's become kind of a sport for Byzantine history, but something you can't easily do even with the Roman Empire in itself. I mean, the early Roman Empire. And with any other polity that you can choose. So a first point I would like to start with is, in fact, the Pars Orientis, that at the time was the eastern part, right, of the empire. An empire was unique. There's never been more than one empire. The empire has been split in 2, 4, but there was never such a thing like 2 or 4 empires. It was always the same empire. This is a universal empire. The Romans had literally conquered all the known world, right? The Romans had conquered the world. Point. It doesn't matter that the world is large. At the time, that was the world, and the Romans had conquered. This time we're talking about a Christian empire that naturally stresses even more the ecumenic side of the story in a Christian fashion. Yet we observe, in fact, the emergence of different centers of power that we can even observe even during the 3rd century, even before Constantine and the refoundation, let's say, of Byzantium, Constantinople. Well, that's a term I never use. Like, I hate the term Byzantium to define Constantinople or the Byzantine Empire. I think it's, frankly, distasteful. But that's me, once again. You know, if it's a convention, I accept it myself. So, we can say that between the end of the 4th century and the first years of the 5th, the separation between the Pars Occidentis and the Pars Orientis of the Roman Empire seems to become irreversible, or at least, just to refuse deterministic takes on this, like, there are factors that are overwhelmingly pushing towards that direction, and nothing that seems to counter that in some way. Naturally, we're talking about after the death of Theodosius in 395, that is basically the last Roman emperor that reconnects, that had ruled over the 2 halves, right? Obviously, even after with the Justinian reconquest, there is something like that, but not recovering all the territories that, as you know, were in Europe, Western Europe and Northwestern Africa. So, and the same Theodosius, and I made a video about this, that is named Theodosius and the Choice of the East, already has pretty clear in mind that in spite of his exploit, that the empire will be divided, in fact, at his succession, split between among his 2 sons, Honorius and Arcadius. Then there are other factors that have to do with the populations that dwell at the frontiers of the empire that now have, in fact, entered the same empire, geographically speaking. Talking about the Visigoths, but also after 410, other groups in the West that increase the differences between the 2 halves, right? There's even this competition that emerges between East and West. Think about the use that Stilicho made of this Germanic presence that even triggered an anti-barbarian reaction in Constantinople, right? The Romans basically played cat and mice with the Germans at that point. A proof that fundamentally even battles like Adrianople were nothing at all the beginning of the end, or, you know, the empire had to fall. No, quite easily. There have been so many turns that history could take at that point very easily. very easily, just a matter of battle won or battle lost, but even a decision or whatever that might have made the western half even surviving. There's a lot of people who have to stress, the East was stronger, the West had to disappear, it was doomed. No, it wasn't anything like that. If you study that up to even to the last decade of the existence of Western half, easily things kind of gone otherwise, right? Obviously not the West rocketing to the stars. Of course, the West was kind of weaker, had less structural unity and less resources, but also these populations that had entered within the empire weren't faring well at all, and they lacked demographic strength. The general picture wasn't quite flattering, telling the truth. And the killing of Stilicho in 408 and the triggered, as you know, this further Visigothic expansion in the west. Now that had occurred for internal political intrigues. We don't really know. We don't know whether Stilicho wanted to play with the Goths, to use them as allies, and because demographic strengths, in fact, were important at this point. And the Romans quite rarely slaughtered entire populations at this time. They needed their numbers. They needed their arms for war and working the land. So that was a pretty valuable asset. But after Stilicho's death and the collapse of the army in the west, the Visigoths start roaming around across Italy and they settle in Gaul and Spain, whatever. And this naturally compromises partly the unity of certain areas of the empire, of the western half. Tendentially, the eastern part being stronger, although risking at one point to collapse. The eastern part at one point risked to make the same end of the west in terms of relation with the Germanic populations, but one way or another they made it to either expel them. There were purges, stuff like that, and especially the east manages to divert many of these populations coming from the steppes and settling at the at borders in the Balkans towards the west, right? So that the west becomes increasingly more Latin/Germanic, and the east remains kind of a more unitary element with a stronger state. So after the end of the Pars Occidentis in 476, this is also maybe an arbitrary date because up to 486 there is still the kingdom of Syagrius in Soissons in northern Gaul, but up to 493 there is Nepos that can be considered contrary to Romulus Augustus the last, in fact the last Western Roman emperor, whatever. However, as we know, Odoacer gives back the Western imperial insignia to Constantinople in exchange for fundamentally a recognition of its obedience and hence a legitimization of his rule in Italy, and things evolve into that direction. The eastern part doesn't at this point suffer any particular territorial loss, right? Any other particular lesion. Right, and this can be explained quite approximately thanks to the capacity of Constantinople, not just as a city, but as basically the center of a state, the true head of a state now, to kind of channel and direct the movements of the Goths, first the Visigoths as we've seen, but also of the Ostrogoths now, towards the western provinces. In fact, basically, Odoacer is knocked out by Theodoric that had settled with these Goths along the Danube in the Illyrian area, and eventually invaded Italy, ruling it on behalf of the eastern, now of the Roman Emperor of Constantinople, right? So, in spite of all the problems that the eastern the empire had to deal between the mid and the end of the 5th century, what we can start calling the Byzantine state, just for the sake of convention now, instead of saying east because there is not east or west anymore but just one single state, the Roman Empire managed at this point, to survive both to the attacks of the external populations and also the regular internal crisis of the economical and commercial balances that occurred at this time in any policy, right? So the strength of the empire allowed, thus, during the 6th century, to maintain alive the perspective of the full recovery of the West, that juridically still was still possession, at least theoretically, given what Odoacer and Theodoric had related themselves to with the empire, under, in fact, the Roman sovereignty, right? So this is a perspective that, if you have followed my contents in the Migration Era playlist, I talk about all the time. And at this point, even when the Western half disappeared, nobody actually thought that that wasn't the Roman Empire anymore. Actually, people that lived even far away, like the Franks, still believed to live technically into what pertained to the Roman Empire, and the reason why we have so many difficulties to accept this, is, to picture it, and are several. First, a catastrophistic idea of what the Middle Ages actually began like, or were in the first place, but also the obsession that we have with 19th century national state borders picture of what an empire should be. Like, these empires fundamentally didn't have a border. Like, the concept of an empire was fundamentally its military power. That's it, and the deterrence and the capability of extending it over other peoples, right? So of course there were frontiers. There was a physical, geographical dimension that today we will keep track of during the explanation. But it's more about the strengths, the resources that this power has, and the projection capabilities of these powers. Especially in military terms, but also in terms of commercial penetration, for example, and in trade balance is very important this time. And still in the 6th century, in fact, now you see that the Byzantine Empire is fundamentally like the only unopposed force in here. The Mediterranean is fundamentally a Byzantine lake. The power, trade, currency, mints, it all works still as if the West was still there, as if the empire, because the empire was still there. And this also before the Justinian's reconquest, right? And as we know, because we made like 3 or 4 videos about this, it's with Justinian that reigned between 527 and 565, that the empire commits itself into this grandiose policy that was not only of military expansion towards the Western Mediterranean, but that also obeyed to a general program of reunification and restoration of Romanity as such. I think this is very important because it's really an ecumenic plan project. So now we don't have time to explain the usual strategic picture of the wall and commenting whether this reconquest was worth it or not, because really there are so many question marks in here, that things we don't really know about what the actual strengths involved were, with what the planning, what the awareness of what was being done, really matched with the expectations, etc. I have an opinion that in those videos I was mentioning, I expressed quite openly, so if you're interested, go watch it in the Byzantine history playlist. You can easily find Justinian Schwerpunkt, it's easy to find. I personally believe that actually Justinian reconquest was a very intelligent thing to do. Like, even if yeah, I know, it failed in the end, but not necessarily everything that fails was a bad idea in the first place. There is a risk attached to every single damn thing these guys were doing at every single time. Like, it still happens, politically speaking, militarily speaking, and there were so many things that couldn't be foreseen at one point. Then saying simply, oh well, this reconquest was doomed since the beginning, or it was kind of silly. I actually know a lot of people who were very competent who actually say like that it was strategically senseless. and I respect their opinion. So I fundamentally don't take away from the equation the possibility that it was also carried out in kind of a disastrous. We think about what the Italian campaign, for example, was, how destructive and how seemingly irresponsible the management of the military affairs was in that situation. But once again, we know too few, and a good historian, in my opinion, should stop saying, okay, we just have to elaborate on what we know and acknowledge that, in fact, this is a very few, considering what it would take to draw a complete picture, right? So I think that those people knew much better than us what they were doing, that we would have not been better doing that, or are planning in taking other actions, let's say, and I kind of trust, and this is my attitude, I want to trust them. And I repeat, I explained these things in fair detail because I spent several hours discussing this stuff about the Justinian reconquest and whether it was worth it or not. And I have formed this opinion that at least at the beginning was a sensible choice, and that it was in part wasted by, especially in the Italian peninsula, against the Goths, in the way the war was waged, especially from the second phase onward, right? During the second phase, fundamentally, because Austro-Gothic Italy had been conquered at one point, and just the Byzantines screwed it up. So just to enumerate, we were talking about first, the Byzantines conquered Vandalic Africa, then we don't know whether southern Iberia was conquered before or after Italy. However, Austro-Gothic Italy as well, and there is this general picture that we have to take into account that this expansion might have been actually necessary to counter Merovingian power. There is even an Atlantic perspective in this sense, especially considering how deeply and strongly Romanized lands like southern France were, and how they're kind of geographically shielded by the Massif Central and the Jura Mountains, and how they can be well defended. Even in fact, in the area, even though we have actually no knowledge of Byzantine troops being sent in southern France, southern Gaul, we know that actually there, Roman mints kept working with the, bearing on the coins the picture of the emperors, etc. So that was a part of the Roman Empire, and that shows us that an empire doesn't literally have to be there with its armies to be recognized as such and to rule even as such. As we were saying before, the major problem with this reconquest were the Italian campaigns. At one point were too long, too costly, and even marked by setbacks, defeats, and retreats. Basically, armies made back and forth for 2 or 3 times along the peninsula that also was destroyed in the process. And this was very bad because fundamentally Italy was the single most important land that it was basically all about it, and what also the Ostrogothic power had represented in the politics of Europe and the Mediterranean. Was very important. I also made videos about this. Maybe you find them in the Migration Era playlist. I don't remember the title, but it's like something like Balance Between Byzantines, Goths, and Franks. It's very important. It's often overlooked as a perspective. But it was very wide range scale of relations, and it doesn't stop just like an anecdote. There were real balances of power in the process that could take also other directions. So at the death of Justinian, anyhow, in 565, it seemed, right, that a significant part of the Pars Occidentes, and especially Italy, had been recovered, right? So, mission accomplished in part, probably with too many costs, but still, in the broader picture, compensated by enough benefits, right? On the internal side, the great military initiative was concentrated in the effort to confer a new cohesion to the universal empire. An effort that was developed essentially in two directions. The first one was a juridical, institutional one, and the other a religious one. This was a program of political unification that could not but have at the center of the topic the internal concord of the Christian world. The empire ideally incorporated the whole Christian community of the church, and every Christian technically was subject of the empire as it had to be. The practice was different, reality was different, but objectively at this point the empire has the authority to claim itself as the only universal Christian power. However, the age of the great Christological controversies had not finished yet. Christological trinitary problems. We made a video just some days ago, the Church in the Age of Councils, if you're interested. And this phase, so the rigorous application of the deliberations of the Council of Chalcedon, that however triggered very important lacerations in areas in which monophysitism remained very widespread. And Justinian tried to fix a new balance by increasing the role of the emperor as the institutional center of the episcopal net, so that this was increasing fundamentally the power of the sovereign over churchly affairs. It was thus the emperor to call in 553 a new ecumenic council. Interestingly enough, that's the same year of the end of the Italian Reconquest, into which the Roman Church continued to be posed on the same level of all the other great metropolis, right? That was particularly meaningful from a political point of view, because Rome instead felt rightly to have this primacy of honor that posed itself as a spiritual authority, let's say, over the others, which still didn't mean that Rome, like the papacy, had developed what it would develop later, like in the 11th century, that we'll see eventually, that would bring, in fact, even to the schism, etc. But this was very important because the papacy had remained fundamentally detached from the empire as long as it was in the Ostrogothic kingdom, and still obviously cooperating with Constantinople, but hoping for an autonomization. Now, Justinian, having reconquered Italy, wanted to stress now the equality of all the metropolitic seats in a sort of balance between the major churches of the empire. And this picture naturally made of the emperor objectively the supreme defender of orthodoxy and the true vertex of Christianity. This explains both the failed attempt to reabsorb monophysitism, that was this too important religious presence to be ignored or simply repressed, because that was the main problem in the eastern provinces, that, what do you do there? You send an army. Like, already these provinces do not like to be under Constantinople in the first place, and that's why they're monophysitists in the first place. You have to be kind of lenient with them in part, but still proclaiming your own authority that you want to have recognized from others. Also Justinian increased the persecutions and repressions against non-Christian professions such as Hebraism. Although the general idea is that these communities also start getting better defined within the same Roman imperial system, right? So that the Jews, for example, were losing more freedom, but still they were tolerated. They had to remain there, and in part also protected from further persecutions. While, for example, other centers like, I don't know, the School of Athens was closed. This great vibrant intellectual movements of the great Hellenistic legacy was progressively choked and channeled into other directions, were mostly statal and aimed at educating the bureaucracy, etc. So this was part of a great plan of centralization, in part, that started also from the religious point of view. It was arguably the most important, right? The military one naturally had absorbed the major resources of the empire, but everything was held together also by the legitimization based on Christian and also on kind of legal principles of the Roman state and Roman law. And in fact, the age of Justinian is also the one of the great codification of Roman law, right? That is the reorganization of the great Roman juridical tradition in a unitary, coherent body. That is the one that in the High Middle Ages would have been known as the Corpus Juris Civilis. That is fundamentally the Theodosian Codex that Justinian just reorders, right? It adds a lot to it, but the base remains fundamentally that one. And this operation responded to an ideological need, but also to a pressing demand for institutional efficiency. That there hadn't been a legal reform, in fact, since Theodosian times at this point, and especially with the reconquest of the Mediterranean, many territories had already developed different, let's say, juridical tendencies, let's say, and forms of local organization. So this reform had to bring to a sort of uniformation of the legal practice everywhere. It was also a matter to thin down the enormous normative mass that had stratified during the centuries in order to grant better the certainty of law and justice. Thus, between 529 and 533 was written a collection of imperial constitution, the ones from the age of Hadrian to the one of Saint Justinian. That was probably the Codex. Then a great syllogy of jurisprudential opinions called the Digesta, and a text that was written with mainly didactical aims, containing the foundations of law, known as the Institutiones. But also during the, even if the cost of the military expansionism was enormous, the Roman Empire still comprehended around 630. So in this almost 70 years later, North Africa, Egypt, today's Syria, Western Iraq, Western Jordania, and besides Lebanon and Palestine, Anatolia, great part of the Balkans, Sicily, Sardinia, and even the presence in Italy remained strong, despite the invasion of the peninsula in 568 by the Longobards that had occupied wide areas of the Italian hinterland. So in these patterns, you say in these surgeries you can see easily the pattern of a continuity of the Hellenistic late antique, whatever you want to call it, society, and forms of economical connection. These were some of the wealthiest lands of the empire. Some lands during the Reconquest had been reoccupied with fundamentally military aims, right? But not all of them were so productive as these ones that are also incidentally most urbanized, usually the one connected by sea, and with Constantinople. And therefore a system that remains fairly easily into the hands of Constantinople during these decades that had already witnessed the general crisis of the Reconquest, right? And the unity of the same empire, in some areas. And this is the point, because the success of the season of Justinian revealed to be substantially ephemeral. Great part of the Balkans, for example, were dominated by groups of Slavs or other invaders, and it therefore escaped to the control of central government. And also this reality, as it wasn't quite officially recognized by imperial authority. This can be explained in part by the fact that especially the Slavs in the Balkans didn't quite congregate into kind of more structured powers that could pose themselves kind of in opposition of the empire. Like, it was mostly a matter of control of certain lands and their agricultural resources, and after all, the empire wasn't faring that bad. However, there were other concerns. For example, the new presence of the Longobards in central northern Italy and the incapacity of the Byzantine Empire to detach a military force, a regular military force, essentially the mobile army, into the western Mediterranean, together with the threat posed by the Avars and the Slavs, and especially in the east by the Sassanid Persians, caused a loss of several Justinian conquests by the end of the 7th century, right? Especially with the affirmation of Heraclius against the Sassanids in 627, only apparently was finished the most dangerous time for the fate of the empire. You know, the Persians get destroyed at the Battle of Nineveh. But even at that, I mean, the Romans had defeated the Persians at one point on several occasions, historically speaking. The Romans marched twice on the Persian capital. They crushed it, the empire, that fragmented. But you know, Persia might have recovered once again at one point. There had been, however, also a political problem internally, even before the Islamic invasions. Now we'll look at, like, this internal crisis triggered by the usurpation of Phocas between 602 and 610, and by the assassination of the Emperor Mauritius. And from the other hand, all of this Avar and Slavic pressure that had arrived to threat even the same Constantinople at one point. So the clash between the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid one had been a further detriment to their resources, to their capability of regenerating them at the same time. So even if the Romans had defeated the Persians, they had come out strongly weakened by the war, and especially in a condition of great economical disorder, right? This war had been really disruptive in some way. So when between 630 and 640 the Arab expansion began under the banner of Islam and of holy war, the imperial resistance was barely more than symbolic, fundamentally. In 642, all Egypt and the Near Eastern provinces were lost, and the Arab armies had penetrated into Libya and Asia Minor, where the Byzantine armies had retreated. Therefore, in the course of 12 years, the empire had lost more than half of its territory and 3/4 of its resources. It was a dramatic balance for an imperial state that had any way to continue to maintain and to equip a large army and an efficient bureaucracy. And therefore, if the many of the developments that led to such transformation were already had already started much time before the crisis of the 7th century, it's also true that this conjunction accelerated the situation and triggered the structural transformations that ensued. Definitely, by the mid-7th century, after that the first impetuous phase of Muslim expansion had finished, the empire didn't occupy but the Balkanic Peninsula in Asia Minor. Think about it from a geographical point of view, right? The Roman power had crumbled, and the empire had reduced basically to the shadow of itself. In 700, the empire had also lost all the North African provinces and those of the Western Mediterranean, except for a residual garrison in the Balearic Islands. And yes, of course, Italy in coastal areas was still safe. However, in the general context of the former provinces, the territories that remained under imperial control were the least rich ones. For example, Egypt, that had been the major source of grain and tax revenues, had been a major blow to the empire, even for supplying the city of Constantinople, for feeding the mob. Right, it was a big deal, and Egypt, if this calculation it is true, had basically represented 1/3 of the whole statal revenues. We talk about gold and grain in total, right? So think about the sheer loss of just this province, what it had triggered. Basically, Egypt had managed to produce more than the old prefectures of the Orient and the Illyricum altogether, right? And while instead the dioceses of Asiana, Pontica, Macedonia, and Orients formed together 4/5 of the gold revenues, with the Pontica and Orients that produced also more than 50% of the grain collected for the army. In late Roman times, however, the bulk of the statal revenues, excepting Egypt, derived from the rich provinces of Syria and Mesopotamia, and Euphrates and Osroene and Phoenicia and Palestine and Cilicia, right? That all were lost after 640 and were only partially recovered, especially along the northern border during the 10th century. So with the loss of Egypt and of the other eastern provinces, and even maintaining effectively the control of all the southern Balkans, with exception of certain coastal areas lost at the end of the 6th and the first half of the 7th century, the state saw the collapse of the general revenue that was reduced to a very small part, that the one it had been during the 6th century. And one of the plausible hypotheses that have been put forward by Jones and eventually by Kay, we're talking about 1/4 of the original. That is, after the first wave of Islamic invasions, the empire had lost 3/4 of its of the 6th century revenues. Right, so it's an immense resizing of the empire that that literally shrank, right? Not just geographically speaking, but also in its projection capabilities, in its power, and in its mindset, right? This event was traumatic, even for the spirituality of the empire, for culture, for this idea of feeling legitimately besieged by several enemies at once. It wasn't just the Muslims; it was also many other peoples that were always eager to, to eat a little bit more of the empire. And this went on for centuries again. Therefore, the defeats and the territorial contraction that had followed the expansion of Islam in the east, starting from 640 from one side, and as we will see now, in a while, with the stabilization of a Bulgar kingdom in the Balkans since 680, had radically altered the political conditions of the Roman Empire and determined a new international political context, right, for whole Europe and the Mediterranean. The evolution of such context was decided fundamentally by political, cultural, and economical relations that the empire was forced to build with its own neighbors, and by the changes that the imperial political ideology had to suffer. At the same time, the cultural imperialism of Constantinople and its important repercussions in the Balkans and in Russia produced effects that would influence and still continue to influence today the Balkans and Eastern Europe. Let's observe, therefore, now more closely these transformations that definitely had a deep impact in the Byzantine world. That is basically the reconfiguration of the principal political military fronts, that is the Balkans, the Eastern Mediterranean and Asia Minor, and Italy. So the situation in the Balkans during the 5th and the 6th century was characterized by the force of the empire to maintain at the head of the various Germanic tribes that emigrated in its own territory, or however that were crossing it. And in the second half of the 6th century, the Gepids, the Herulds, and the Longobards strongly alarmed imperial diplomacy, but the picture was complicated when the pressure of these ethnicities grew under the push of the migrations of new peoples coming from the east. From one side were the Slavs that basically just followed the movement, the vacuum left open by the movements of these peoples, and basically pouring into the central and southern European lands. But especially was the arrival of the Avars, this Turkic, apparently, but it was probably more ethnically composed confederation that dominated the fundamentally the Pannonian Basin at this point, after its arrival in Europe since 580, and that, as we have seen in 626, even besieged the same Constantinople for some weeks, right? Well, all this caused a terrible complication of the picture. Further, in 680, there is the arrival of new populations of Turkic origin, the Bulgars, that after having defeated an imperial army under the Emperor Constantine IV, settled in the south of the Danube Delta, altering the situation in a kind of definitive way, right? Up to, the Avars had just remained there in the Pannonian plain, that they had gone into different directions. Yeah, they had tried to extend their power south, but there wasn't any major power between, close next to Constantinople. Well, the Bulgars fill this area and represent this novelty, right? The Bulgars were in themselves a new ethnical element, and they had this nomadic organization, but also combined with a certain degree of technology that they kind of motivated from the Byzantines themselves, that allowed them to affirm their own hegemony, the political hegemony on this region of the Balkans. Therefore, a Bulgar kingdom was consolidated. The head of it was a Khan, and this entity would be destroyed only in the 10th century by hand of the Emperor Basil II. But throughout all this time, it represented a constant threat for the security of imperial territory in the Balkans. Right? Throughout all the 8th and the 9th century and up to the beginning of the 10th, the influence and power of the Bulgars, and now basically the Bulgarians as they had transformed into, grew. Right, in spite of the counterattacks that were carried out successfully by the Emperor Constantine V between the 60s and the 80s of the 8th century. The worst moment for the Byzantine was in 811, when the Bulgarian Khan defeated and destroyed the imperial army, killing the same Emperor Nicephorus I. In 860, there is the conversion to Christianity of certain elements of the Bulgarian elite that would have had to would stabilize fundamentally the situation in favor of Constantinople. But the gradual Byzantinization, let's say, of the Bulgarian elites contributed only to the development of an imperialistic policy from the side of the Bulgarians that at this point hoped to bring both states under the rule of the same Bulgarian dynasty, and in particular the strong affirmation of the Bulgarian imperial ideology under the Tsar Samuel gave birth to a conflict after a fairly quiet moment, peaceful moment at the end of the 10th century, at the end of which Bulgarian independence was annihilated. As we have seen, in great part of the Balkans up to the Danube could be recovered at the beginning of the 11th century. And in spite of occasional rebellions, this region remained steadily, firmly into the hands of the Byzantines up to the beginning of the Fourth Crusade, in between 1203 1204, and eventually the Latin division of the empire after 1204 brought to the rapid rise in the autonomization of certain political Balkanic political entities and the birth of new states, among which perhaps the most important is definitely the Serbian Empire of Stefan Dusan. And it was only the arrival of the Muslims in the 14th century that would have radically modified the characteristics of the region from a political, territorial point of view. So, talking about the Eastern Europe, like a different nature had been the one of the relation between the Byzantines and the Rus. Right, these were Norse settlers that had come from this river net of central Russia that had reached the Black Sea to trade. These were, we know now that the Slavic element was way more majority here. It wasn't like these elites. Yeah, they were they intermarried with the Norse that also composed an important part of the military force, but still the whole construction was fundamentally Slavic in itself. And these powers were growing rapidly and began to make incursions and raids into Byzantine territory. That, however, were repelled, and the Rus soon became commercial partners of the empire, surely around the 20s of the 10th century, providing also the mercenary troops with which, starting from the 80s of the 10th century, was formed the famous bodyguard of the Byzantine Emperor, and exactly in the same years, under Vladimir I, Prince of Kiev, it was matured the conversion to Christianity of the Russian people. So in such conditions, the political context intensified also through a matrimonial alliance signed between Basil II and Saint Vladimir, that in fact married one sister of his, and the event started a long period of Byzantine cultural influence on the Rus that would have been of dramatic importance for the following developments of Russian culture and religiosity, contributing strongly to the formation of the Tsarist idea eventually. I've made a video on, a playlist on medieval Russia. If you're interested into it, you can look at that, because I discussed this, especially religious policy in the construction of the Tsarist power in later Middle Ages, actually, when the Byzantines were already falling to the Ottomans, actually. But especially for that, because now Russia could claim like to be another pole of orthodoxy. And so the depth of the Byzantine cultural penetration in the Balkans is witnessed in an even clearer way in the organization and of the doctrine of the local Orthodox Church. Right? It's not a surprise that after the Ottoman conquest, the new Ottoman regime would have found actually in the Church and in its structure the ideal instrument to govern the conquered peoples. Right? And in this way, the Church would have maintained, in fact, even after the end of the empire, a political role that was not very different from the one that the Western Church had to acquire in the context of the Romano-Germanic kingdoms between the 6th and the 9th century. So let's take a look now to Anatolian Asia Minor. So in this up to the end of its history, let's say between the 30s and 40s of the 7th century, when it was invested by the Islamic armies, the Persian Empire, the Persian Sassanid Empire, had remained the major rival of the Roman Empire in the East. Right. After this, it would have been the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates to represent a constant threat for the Byzantines. It's a complex history that had alternate phases. In a first moment, from the 30s of the 7th century and the 20s of the 8th, the Arabo-Islamic invasions followed uninterruptedly, right, aiming at the destruction of the Roman Empire. In a second phase that arrives up to the mid-8th century, a sort of precarious balance was determined. Even if the Muslim incursions kept to be, source of political and economical confusion in the empire, right? And a third phase that arrives up to the mid of the 11th century, when the collapse of the Abbasid Caliphate and the ensuing political fragmentation rendered it possible to the reaffirmation of the imperial preeminence in the region. In fact, since the 860 roughly, the caliphate had been severely weakened by internal discord, and it's at this point that the Byzantines revive their military initiative. Even though the very strenuous opposition and sometimes victorious opposition of the local Muslim military chiefs, like the ones of Aleppo, for example, between the 940 and 960, managed to stem partly the Byzantine expansion. Anyway, the empire managed, however, to reconquer great parts of Syria, in northern Syria fundamentally, and Iraq. At the death of the emperor soldier Basil II, known as Bulgaroctonus, that is the exterminator of the Turks, that had occurred in 1025, through the military success in the Balkans and Asia Minor, the empire had come back to be the most important political force in the eastern basin of the Mediterranean and in southeastern Europe, the only rival being the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt and Syria. It is mostly the arrival of the Seljuk Turks in 1060 to modify newly and deeply the situation. Internal political dissents, certain military defeats inflicted by the Seljuk sovereign Alparslan to eastern Anatolia in 1071, among which must be remembered especially the one at Manzikert, that caused the loss of Asia Minor, that from that moment onwards was dominated by groups of nomads, of essentially Turkic nomadic shepherds, the Turkomans, that represented a constant threat for every form of sedentary occupation. From that moment, the possessions of Constantinople were reduced to the coastal regions, even if in the west it was more exposed to the attacks and the infiltrations from the plateau. Even that position turned out to be precarious. It's under the emperors of the Comnenian dynasty between 1081 and 1185 that, in part thanks to the clever exploitation of the First and the Second Crusade in particular, as Byzantine authority was reconfirmed in all the western part of the Anatolian Peninsula, and after a further disastrous, apparently at least disastrous defeat, that was the one against the Seljuks at Myriokephalon in 1176. However, great part of the territories that the Byzantines had recovered went again lost. Looking at the Italic Peninsula, so the relations with Italy and the West for Constantinople were not less complex than the ones in the Balkans in the East. And under Justinian, these lands, as we've seen, were conquered at kind of dearly, at a dear price, against the Ostrogoths, and in Italy, but as we've seen also the Vandals in North Africa and this other southeastern corner of the Iberian Peninsula. The major change had occurred with the appearance of the Longobards in Italy that led pretty soon to the fragmentation of the imperial domination in the peninsula. It was reduced fundamentally to a discontinuous ensemble of regions governed each one by their own military commander or dukes. The imperial territory in the northeastern coastal plains and in the central ones of the peninsula, so we're talking essentially about Istria, the Venetian lagoons, the Romagnol and Marches area up to Ancona. I made a video about this. It's called Byzantine Italy. I think the Venetian lagoon, Sicily, and I don't remember because it's just a set of, I think, Apulia. I made a video about that. It can be interesting. However, all this ensemble was represented by an exarch, right? An officer, a Byzantine officer with a military and civil authority. The exarchate was constituted around 584, like an energetic response to the Longobard invasion, and it extended formally its authority also in the south on the duchies of Rome, Naples, the one of Calabria, that incorporated what is today the region of Calabria, but also this land would be essentially the heel of the boot. While Sicily instead was governed directly by Constantinople, that had made it sort of a headquarter to counter Saracen piracy at that point. However, in Italy, the distance from Constantinople, the political and cultural differentiation of the various local realities, together with the influence of the spiritual and political power of the popes of Rome, soon led to a gradual but unavoidable weakening of imperial authority. It's a sum of factors, fundamentally. The end of the Exarchate in 751, when its capital, Ravenna, was conquered by the Longobards, and the growing papal dependency on the support of the Franks in the conflict against the Longobards, and the increased autonomy of the same Byzantine political formations that were often clashing against each other, led, since the beginning of the 9th century, to a substantial shrink and resizing of the imperial control, even in lands as Calabria, Lucania, and Sicily. Other centers like Naples, that had remained strongly Byzantine, de facto were independent, and even Venice, whose importance began to grow at the beginning of the 9th century, remained only nominally an imperial territory. So the Byzantine sphere of influence suffered this further blow from the loss of Sicily that was conquered by the Muslim armies during the 9th century, and despite between the end of the 9th century and the beginning of the 11th, the political military power of the empire in southern Italy could in part reconsolidate, right? There is the reconquest of Bari that had been Saracen between 842 and 871, and also the renewed imposition of imperial sovereignty over the Longobard Duchy of Benevent, and also this new administrative organization in Apulia and Calabria that gave back to the Byzantine presence a new compactness. Hence we have a process of re-Byzantinization that culminated into the attempt of a sort of unitary government of all the Byzantine territories of Adriatic Italy through the constitution of a high magistracy known as the Catapanate that had to coordinate the themes of Longobardy, that is Apulia, and then Lucania and Calabria. So the Byzantine reprisal in the 10th century was not an ephemeral phenomenon, and on the contrary, it had some important repercussions on the cultural identity of the same interested regions. This wasn't so deep, however, to invert the tendency of political fragmentation of southern Italy. The nature of the geographical context, for example, that is demarked by an elevated grade of differentiation and conflict, telling the truth, favored the initiative of the Norman mercenaries that appeared in this area, called exactly by the local Longobard princes at the beginning of the 11th century. The Norman action transformed itself very soon, under the guide of the Hauteville and of Robert Guiscard in particular, in a program of political routing that since the mid-11th century would have produced this radical reconfiguration of the southern political space. The predominion of the first Norman political formations was sanctioned, in fact, on the battlefield and formalized by a papal investiture. And after this ended, in fact, the Byzantine presence in southern Italy. The empire, however, managed to impede a further Norman expansion in the Illyrian coastal region after the defeat of Robert Guiscard and his son Bohemond, from the side of Alexius I Comnenus, 1081-1118. However, the Norman naval expeditions actually began a true and serious threat for the empire, especially under the reign of the Norman king Roger II, reigning between 1130 and 1154, that was toying with the idea to conquer the same Constantinople. The Normans would go as far as raiding Thessalonica. It was the second region of the empire. And in spite of this hostility, the Norman kingdom was strongly influenced by the Byzantine bureaucratic administrative tradition, and also that can be observed into the Byzantine artistical styles. Towards the end of the 12th century, the interests of Normans and Byzantines ended up to overlap, given the common needs of resistance against the ambitions of the Germanic emperors. But the Fourth Crusade would, however, put an end to every possibility of an alliance on the long period, and the problem of the Byzantine presence in Italy cannot be understood, however, outside the process that more in general between the 8th and the 11th century progressively separated the religious and cultural world of Constantinople from the West that had a Frankish hegemony. And this was a process in which both the protagonism of the Eastern emperors into the doctrinal controversies, as demonstrate especially the events like of the iconoclasty and the Photian schism, and the aspirations of the papacy to defend its own autonomy from any temporal power, played decisive roles. On the complexity of the political-religious question of the iconoclasm, we will talk maybe later. However, without commenting it further, I made some videos about iconoclasm. If you're interested, you can look at that. We remember the crowning of Charlemagne as Emperor of Rome in the year 800. So the event was consumed in a phase of particular political instability at Constantinople, and in a few years the Eastern Emperor had to take act to realize officially the great novelty that had occurred in the West. And at this point, the political cultural distance of Rome from the East was increasing, right, in favor of the Western one. And at the same time, the ecumenic picture of the Eastern imperial dominion was entering irremediably in crisis. The cultural diversity that was always more marked during the 9th century was expressed especially at the level of ecclesiastical policy, but it was, let's say, worsened by the competition between the Franks, the Byzantines, and the papacy for the political and religious hegemony, especially in the context of Central and Western Balkans that were areas only partially Christianized at the time. This competition was complicated also by conflicts internal to the same Eastern Church between parties that were siding under the patriarchs and that alternated Constantinople for between the 50s and the 80s of the 9th century. Photius, that was this cultured and influent layman that was imposed in 858 by Emperor Michael III, and Ignatius, that came from the monastic tradition, fundamentally. It is an important step in that sense. The parties at that point called the papacy to intervene, and it was in fact Pope Nicholas I in 863 to provoke the schism that takes the name of the Photian one. Because Photius basically didn't curb to the Roman injunction to give back the patriarchal soil to Ignatius, and it was the so-called Photian schism that was fed by these subtle Trinitarian controversies at the same time, and that was also the expression of new tensions existing between the Eastern Church and the Western one that compromised, importantly, many opportunities of reconciliation, of reapproaching of the two churches. And in spite of the different attempts to sign new matrimonial alliances with the Frankish court at the end of the 8th and the beginning of the 9th century, and especially with the Ottonians during the 10th, the growing political, cultural, and military force of the Western world definitely represented kind of an insurmountable impediment to every project of reaffirmation of the Byzantine Empire into at this point actually the central Mediterranean, and this was a great problem because the enemies were getting closer. Like Italy was this, could easily bridge an invasion of the. First of all, Italy in itself was, especially the south, was wealthy at the point that these powers were always looking at invading it, but also from there, a new power in Mediterranean could have been established that could become a problem really for the empire, given that the Muslims, they were kind of a problem in that sense too, but they had a fairly unstable power. They didn't have necessarily, even against the same empire, as many problems as they had against the Western Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was forming. So it was a very complicated political game, but the feeling this of reciprocal distrust between the Western Latin Germanic and the Eastern Byzantine worlds was destined to weaken further. In fact, in 1054, the apex of the Papal Reformation that we also discuss very often at Schwerpunkt. If you're interested, we can look at Papal History playlist. Leo III and the Patriarch Michael Cerularius pushed for this jurisdictional conflict over the cities of the churches, of southern Italy, up to the point of reciprocal excommunication. So this schism was not recomposed, and basically the distance between East and West came to the point of no return. The weakening of the empire and the civil wars of the mid and the end of the 11th century and the development of the Crusader movement introduced a further serious factor of complication, right? Even from a cultural point of view, you find the stereotype about the arrogance and the ignorance of the Westerners, to which was contraposed the also exaggerated one of the false and treacherous spirit of the Byzantines. And in spite the revival that the empire knew under the Komnenian dynasty at the end of the 11th and during the 12th century, that rendered even possible coming closer, and even the formation of a strongly pro-Western faction, Constantinople, promoted by Emperor Manuel I, ruling between 1143 and 1189, the conflict between the imperial interest and the one of the Italian merchants, especially in the commercial space of the Central Eastern Mediterranean, together with the cultural difference to the intrigue and let's say opportunism of Venetian policy, ended up to unleash in 1203-04 the Fourth Crusade, the sack of Constantinople, and the division of the Eastern Empire into a certain number of Latin reigns and principates. So this was way more briefly than what I expected, what I wanted to tell today. And as you understand, it's a very complicated picture to simplify and today we didn't tell a lot of very very important things telling the truth. But it's also important to have clear in mind this major steps, this scansion of this story, because first of all, I think it gives you more in terms of even synthesis capacities are important sometimes. But secondly, it makes you feel more the continuity of what the Roman state objectively was, and yet also the important blows and with all its consequences that triggered transformations, changes, reshapes. And definitely we will keep talking a lot about Byzantine history. It doesn't end here, let's say, but we will probably take similar looks at this period, trying to understand how certain phenomena can be interpreted, how certain transformation, how certain changes. For example, as I was saying at the beginning, actually, we just stopped now talking about the Fourth Crusade. The Fourth Crusade is an incredibly complex event that, just anecdotally now, I tell you, but when I hear commented elsewhere, it's always either pro or against someone. It's like never actually understanding the complexity of what happened. In fact, the same Byzantines basically called the Crusaders that the Crusade had been born for completely different purposes, not just in theory, but in practice. That what happened during Fourth Crusade was the consequence of so many factors that could have gone in a completely different way. Even what we were telling before about the imperial policy of Manuel I and all the transformation, people said the Angeli triggered, now what was in 1204 the empire in crisis, for example. Well, it doesn't seem to be sufficient historical evidence for claiming that. Did Manuel I weaken the empire? No, actually, I'm a great estimator of Manuel Comnenus, telling the truth. And there are so many different takes sometimes, even the battles of Manzikert and Myriokephalon. Many people said, those were the worst, the Byzantines. But about Myriokephalon, we don't even know what technically happened. That's a story I like to tell every time. Maybe today I don't tell that, but that the Battle of Myriokephalon was this overwhelming Byzantine defeat is actually not supported. I mean, we have no actual historical certainty about that, given because many people just take the account of the battle written, what was it, Nicetas Coniates and a few others, and say, it was a defeat. But if you look at the diplomacy at the time, all the letters that were being exchanged here and there, the fact that the war continued for 2 years, at a point the same Iconium had to be evacuated because the Byzantines were still around and threatening the most powerful Seljuk city in the area after the same battle, tells you that something different was going on. The same Manzikert was a pretty heavy blow, but the Byzantines, up to Myriokephalon, were about to reconquer all what they had lost. Many changes had occurred because even the landscape of Anatolia changed, like between Byzantine and Seljuk domination, right? The Byzantines had made it something very different. It was a kind of even fertile area. There were lots of dams as well. The Seljuks basically pastoralized it. They had a completely different form of administration. Certain things reverted to. So it's very complicated. The same relation with the West. That is never deepened enough, in my opinion. It's always dealt like with this sense of reciprocal suspicion, and not with actual, that still echoes this kind of prejudices that we have about that story as Westerners, and maybe as I don't know. There are national biases in this sense, but not as an actual story. Let's look at the balance of this. Not even the relations with Rome. Very easily we say, maybe even before I said, that, Rome at one point just escaped the Byzantine influence, stuck with the Franks. Well, it's not actually completely true. Like, the popes were extremely clever. There's been rarely such a clever power like the papacy has been, especially during the Middle Ages. Rome remained quite open to the idea of even reuniting the churches, even after the schism at one point. I mean, it was technically feasible, or at least with some compromise, but theoretically Rome looked at east as much as it was looking west most of the time, even after Charlemagne. And there is all the Saracen piracy we didn't talk about, the recovery of Crete, of Cyprus. So many things that we couldn't discuss, even the relation with the Rus, the Balkanic areas, whatever. We will deepen that in my Byzantine history playlist. I think I have already. There's a substantial amount of videos at this point. If you're curious, maybe you want to hear more from me, but I don't hope that, in the sense that, I more or less, up to this point, Byzantine history, my god, 35 videos. I didn't know that. I think it were much less. Well, so yeah, you definitely have a lot to know about, to watch here. And so yeah, I'm glad I'm deepening this part of history, because I think many people complain people don't talk about Byzantine history, but as a matter of fact, we still deal with Byzantine history in a kind of a weird way as Western society, but honestly, I don't feel like we're actually not talking enough about it. I think especially Anglo-Saxon historiography has been a terrific job at recovering the attention for the Byzantine Empire and spreading it a bit everywhere. I mean, some of the most fashionable topics today it's mostly the late antique, the migration era, but it still involves this idea of the eastern half of the empire, and we still kind of exercise this world. We look at it in ways that are still resenting, right, kind of suffering of this idea that we built about Byzantium, right? This weird kind of thing that was kind of decadent and thing, but we went beyond that, and I think especially among young people, there's a great attention towards the Byzantine Empire. I think that there is a whole generation of kids today that they're maybe even my age now, because they're between their teens and their 20s, who are like, maybe they don't know literally anything about the Middle Ages, but they know only about the Byzantine Empire, and that's a pretty amazing feat considering the overwhelming ignorance that exists about history, and especially the worst type one that still exists towards the Middle Ages, that represents a complete failure of Western education, in my opinion, at this point. We don't teach history in schools. We still don't care about it. We're doing pretty seriously messed up stuff with our society, which is frankly disgusting, but I see it. Every time I make a video about whatever topic about medieval Europe, people may no, so, like a few tens of views. I make a video about the Byzantine Empire, hundreds and hundreds of views in a row. Like, why? Like, sometimes I even wonder. It's maybe because we went from an extreme to another. Like, I don't know why did it. I personally, I must say, I like Byzantine history, as I was saying before. Where every time I had the opportunity to learn about it, at university, when I mainly discovered it. I was fascinated by it even in high school or whatever, but I discovered it kind of historically and more seriously later on, in my very early 20s, and I've always liked it, but I kind of never, I think it was a big area that I didn't know enough about that was very important to know about. But it's not that I became about the empire. Like, personally, and especially ever since I started Schwerpunkt and I took a bit of, books back again, even simple manuals, I started to reread, to rethink, to recover maybe some topics about especially the Latin Germanic West, to which I belong myself, telling the truth, and I, and not for kind of chauvinistic reasons, I don't give a damn about that, but I kind of looked at this world like in the sense that the Middle Ages have to be known as a big picture. Like, you can't stick to just one entity or another, or pretending to be a fanboy or something, because that's not history, that's just a joke, right? But many people do, and the Middle Ages have this problem that they are all fragmented. Like, while you teach, maybe that's the reason why people like so much Byzantine history, but because it's the history of something defined, right? There is this state, it's basically Roman and religiously Christian and culturally Hellenic, and you can follow it, and it's kind of big, and people are attracted by giants in this sense on the political map and their military capabilities and stuff. But then it's difficult to recollect, like to recompose all the picture with all the other powers that existed there. Unfortunately, I must say that even young people and that are grown old with video games and about, I don't know, there are so many of these types, like Total War series or Paradox series, all this stuff that emphasize kind of strategic gaming, that they, I assume that maybe they understand a bit more certain things than maybe their predecessors in under regard of certain issues of that war, but they kind of still think about the big empire. Like, that is something that especially when it's coupled with nationalism, with this idea that there was the big state, it was so cool, was so powerful, with all these knights, with all these warriors, like it. And that's the idea. Like, that's where people are attracted by that. And most of historical interest, I think, it's driven by this, which sucks fundamentally. And I tell you this from a channel that deals chiefly with military history, so I'm not biased about this. I am pretty aware of what that means and why, and you should take it from me in the sense, if I study military history at this point at kind of a decent level in my path and my education, I can tell you, look, you can't just reason like that. You shouldn't reason like that in the first place, because that's dangerous. That doesn't make you understand what you presume that you are understanding, right? Because you don't. So yeah, it's often like, and I realize that most interests are nationalistic, and I can tell you easily because all videos that I make are usually around a certain time and place in history, corresponding even to a people, to a nation, to a country, whatever. So I realized that when that explicitated, like I talk about the army of dead people, fundamentally I get more views simply because I know that there is a bunch of nationalists out there that search for that ethnic name and want to know everything about their power and their armies and how cool they were and powerful. And this is frankly pathetic, because you can be fascinated as much as you like, as I am, with the militaries, and I love Byzantine military history, Byzantine army. I made a playlist about that. But I like everything about military history. You don't have to be like the strongest empire around just to be cool or to deserve attention. And there are certain perspectives in medieval history that are forgotten. They're definitely forgotten. Fortunately enough, the Byzantine one at this point in history doesn't seem to be one of them anymore, despite it's been for several centuries. and that was disgusting, I give you that, but you also had to understand it historically speaking, historiographically speaking, why that was the case. And since we know it, we should know for the same reason that there's plenty of other stuff that waits for our attention to be attracted by it, and yet it doesn't happen. Maybe another problem is that medieval history is not so open source. Like, it's fairly easy to find stuff about medieval history on the internet. You literally can learn the world through that. But when it comes to serious publishing editions, like, it's a bit more difficult, and especially sources sometimes are not so easily accessible. Many are not translated, so like, if you don't know Latin, you can't go very far when you study medieval history. It doesn't matter whether the people you're studying didn't speak Latin, for example, or didn't even write. Like, it happens. You must know Latin, otherwise you can't be a medievalist. End of the story. Like, it's not being harsh. It's literally what it is, and many people don't, nor can learn about it, obviously. For example, I can Latin, but I can't Greek. So I don't know I love ancient warfares. Many sources are in Greek. I have to translate it with another language. Yeah, I understand something even for ancient Greek, but like, it's very few. Mostly etymologically speaking, or certain words, what they actually mean semantically. But I can't translate a phrase. I don't understand anything about verbs, for example. But with Latin, that I realize by knowing it, even though I don't use it enormously, also because I studied a period in which there's plenty of vernacular sources, but at the same time, even Latin is kind of easier because it's medieval Latin of certain eras. It's even kind of closer to vernacular, or the lexicon is more simple, especially the syntax is more simple. So these are maybe a series of factors that explain certain things, and that can be one. Anyhow, well, this was just a digression and excursus talking about this historical awareness today. Anyhow, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time. See you next time. Bye.